All right, so we are recording. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me this morning. We're doing another coffee with the curator here at the museum. I'm Alex Dubois. I'm the curator of collections here at the Litchfield Historical Society. You may have seen me. We've done a couple programs live here at the museum so far. So this is our first Tuesday talk that we're doing as part of our month-long series, Secrets of the Spy Master: Decoding the Tallmadge Story. So this is a program we're really excited to bring to you, and we're going to be doing it through the rest of this month and into June. We're going to be talking all about Benjamin Tallmadge and his work in the Culper Spy Ring and his life here in Litchfield. So today's program is going to focus a lot on some portraits that we have of him, and then we're going to move into some context about painting during the Revolution and the role that artists had. So we are recording this, so if you have to step off, if you want to come back and watch it again, we will have it posted on Facebook and our YouTube channel. We have the chat feature and the Q&A feature today, so if you have questions, comments, if you want to just let us know maybe where you're watching from or anything that you're interested in learning about Tallmadge or anything like that, you can drop them in the chat or the Q&A, and I should be able to see them here on my screen. So I'm going to start by showing you a couple objects that we have here in the museum collection, and then I'm going to switch over to share some slides with you to talk about some stuff that's outside of our collection. So if you watched our special preview video that we did last Friday, you might have heard me talk about the fact that we have 4 distinct portraits, so 4 different portraits of Benjamin Tallmadge here in our collection. And this is really a kind of rare thing for one collection to have that many likenesses of the same person, especially since the Tallmadge portraits that we have document most of his life, from his time as an officer during the Revolution to his time as an elder statesman here in Litchfield. So I find it really interesting to look at these portraits, think about what they can tell us about what was going on at the time in Tallmadge's life and in America in general, and take a little bit of a deeper dive and use them as a way to contextualize some of that history. So that's what we're going to do today. So we're going to start with his 2 wartime portraits. So these are portraits of him that were done not necessarily during the war, but of him as an officer in the war. So both of these were done, we think, around 1783, so right at the tail end. At the end of the war, when Tallmadge would have had probably more time to actually sit and have his portrait taken. So the first one we're going to look at, and this is one you've probably, if you've done any research about Tallmadge, you've probably seen. And I do apologize that it is encapsulated, so it might be some glare there on the screen, but I'll get it as close as possible. So you can see that this is a sketch of Benjamin Tallmadge as a young officer. You can see he's got his signature underneath there. So this is a fairly common thing that you would see in the 1800s and 19th century of people who served in the Revolution or politicians. They would do a portrait of them, add their signature, and they would print this as an engraving, and you could buy it and have it in your home. So if you look at the engraving itself, you can see that the artist really focused a lot on capturing Tallmadge's face in great detail. But he also gave us a really good representation of his uniform and that distinctive cap that he's wearing, which is that crested cap that was worn by a mounted unit called the Dragoon. So Tallmadge served in the Dragoons. And you can see, if you see that helmet, it's a general indicator that's what you're looking at. So then I also pulled from our collection, just to give you a sense of what that might look like. So this is, and I'll try to get it so you can see the whole thing. So I would love to tell you that this is Benjamin Tallmadge's Dragoon helmet. Unfortunately, it's not. So this is a later example, probably from the War of 1812 or around that period, of a helmet that was worn by someone serving in the Dragoons. So it's not Tallmadge's helmet, but it is a really rare and interesting example that we like to bring out when we talk about Tallmadge, to give you a sense of what a part of his uniform might look like. You can see it's got this really wonderful pierced crest at the top. It's got the, which is probably like a velvet ribbon around the side, and you can see on the front, it's mostly gone off, but there would have been some painted decoration on the front as well. And this is on display at our museum. So if you do, when we are open again, you want to see, you can come back and take a look at it more closely. So Tallmadge accepts a commission as a lieutenant in the Connecticut Regiment in 1776. His first battle is the Battle of Long Island, which happens in August of that year. But by December of the same year, he accepts another commission, and that is for a captaincy in Colonel Eliza Sheldon's 2nd Regimental Light Dragoons. So this is when he joins the Dragoon Regiment, which is how most people remember his service. By April of the same year, 1777, he's promoted to major. He finishes as a colonel, and he's present at the battles of Brandywine, Monmouth, Germantown, and other engagements as well. So he does have a very decorated service record during the war, in addition to what he did involving the spy ring, which is something that our educator is going to talk a lot about. So I'm going to try not to spoil all that for you today, and let that sort of come in future weeks. But I also wanted to show you another image of Tallmadge. So this is the second image that we have. This one, so the first one was a print, so it wasn't an original. It was, an engraving that was done. But the one I'm about to show you is an original, and it is small. So I'm going to see if I can give you a good image of it. So this is a portrait miniature of Benjamin Tallmadge, again in uniform, but this one is in color, which is nice. And you can get a sense of just how small it is based on how it looks being held between my two fingers. So I'll let you take a look at it, and then I'll talk a little bit about it. And I do have a photo of it as well to show you so you can see it in more detail. All right, so this is a portrait miniature done by an Irish artist named John Trumbull, who was actually fought with the Irish Loyalists. He sort of left service, went to New York, which was occupied by the British, and started his art career. And we are pretty confident that we know when this miniature would have been painted. So in 1783, in December, the American forces are going into New York that has been occupied by the British. So the American forces are now occupying New York again. Washington is there, and he invites his officers to a place called Fraunces Tavern, where he delivers sort of a farewell address to his officers, signaling the end of the war. Benjamin Tallmadge, we know, attends this meeting at Fraunces Tavern. So he's in New York at this time, going to Fraunces Tavern, but it's probably while he's in New York that he sits for John Trumbull, who we know was also in New York at the time and has this miniature painted. So we also know that Trumbull, starting in about 1784 and moving forward, he tended to paint sitters who are members of the Society of the Cincinnati, if people have heard of that. He usually would paint them wearing their society medal, their society ribbon. Because the miniature, Tallmadge is not wearing his medal in this, it's probably done before 1784. So again, all things point to it being done in 1783. So when I started thinking about these two portraits and looking into the history a bit, I really was struck by the role that American artists and artists in America played in creating the visual history and the visual identity of the American Revolution. And that's sort of where I went off for the second part of this talk, is to look at the role that artists played in creating what we remember visually as the American Revolution. So now I'm going to switch to screen share, because we have some slides. These are things that we don't have in our collection, but the first photo will be, there it goes. So this is a really close-up photograph of that Benjamin Tallmadge miniature that we have in our collection. You can see a little bit more of the detail. You can even see some of the brush strokes in there. And you can see it's also in a really nice tool leather case that we have. So when I talk about creating the visual identity of the American Revolution, we're talking about two things. One of them being portraits or portrait miniatures or sketches or other representations of people who served in the war. This is mainly, the officers, politicians, heroes of the revolution who are captured in that way. If you think about how many of these you've probably seen, just think about how many paintings of George Washington in his military uniform you might have seen in museums, across the country. You can really get a sense that the portraits are pretty plentiful. They're a pretty good, wide record of people who served in the war, and they're fairly common. The second thing is the actual views or paintings or depictions of the battles and events of the war. And these are less common, and they're really what I want to focus on today, because I think it's a really interesting story. So if you think about the revolution, this is, well before photography is invented, well before photography is in use. So the only way to really capture the events going on are through the written record or through artist depictions of what's going on. In fact, in the Civil War, photography is pretty common. So both sides of the conflict actually hired battlefield photographers to go around and shoot photos of military and civilian activities, camp life, soldiers, and the locations of the battlefield. The photography process they were using at the time didn't allow them to take actual shots or images of the battle themselves. So they couldn't capture action because the scene needed to stay still for a certain amount of time to make the wet plate process work. But they were able to really capture battlefields sort of right after the action happened. And because of this, the visual history of the Civil War was captured sort of as it happens and then disseminated to people in this country and really around the world. So it was a much different experience than in the Revolution. When we talk about images of the Revolution, the important thing to remember is that most of them are actually done after the war is over. So whenever you see an image of the Revolution, you really have to think about when it was painted, who it was painted by, and what the context was. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about. But that's not to say that there aren't contemporary images of the revolution that were done while the war was still going on. So this is a really famous one that you might have seen. This is Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre. So I say Paul Revere's engraving because he did the plate, but the image itself was actually captured by another artist, and Revere sort of just copied the image that he had made. So this was done, so this was for sale in March of 1770, only a few weeks after the actual event took place. And if you take a look at it, and if you know about the event itself, you can see that this is more than just a representation of the event. This is a form of propaganda for the Patriots. So this is obviously a scene as Revere wanted it to be shown. So you can see things like the British are organized into a neat and concise firing line. There's the officer behind who's given a clear order to fire. If you can see, if you look really closely at the faces of some of the British soldiers, it even looks like a few of them are smiling or having some sense of joy in this event. So really it was made so that the British looked menacing, the British looked cruel, and it looked like a very deliberate act that was going on there. The colonists, on the other hand, are all done a little bit softer features to look more innocent. They're all dressed in pretty fine clothes, even though in the actual event, most of the colonists present were laborers. And there are a couple things like there's a figure of a woman who seems to be in mourning for the event. There's a few things that were obviously added in as symbols of what's going on. So again, this is something where you have to consider the context of this image, who was making it, and what they hoped to gain by doing so. So Revere clearly has an agenda in this instance, and you can even see at the bottom he's added a few lines of poetry or prose based on what happened, and there's sort of messages in there as well. So these are a bit, these are pretty famous actually, representations of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. So it's a set of 4 that we'll take a look at in 2 slides. So this happens April 1775, really the first military clashes of the Revolution. And a few days after it takes place, a man named Amos Doolittle, who becomes a pretty well-known engraver, arrives in Cambridge with a company of New Haven militia. And once he gets to Cambridge, he asks to take leave to go to Lexington and Concord and to really try to record some idea of what the battle was like. So sometime in May, he visits both towns. He acquires sketches of the grounds, the sites where they took place. He talks to different eyewitnesses who saw the battle happen. And what happens is he produces 4, and I'll advance the slides so you can see the other 2. He produces 4 copperplate engravings of the battle based on 4 paintings that were done by his traveling companion, who was an artist named Ralph Earl. So anyone who's been to our museum or done some of our events will know that name probably. I won't go into it too much because Ralph Earl is going to come back in a couple weeks' time in another program that we're doing. But Ralph Earl, we believe, did a few quick paintings of these scenes. Doolittle took those, made engravings of them, printed these, and then sold them as sets. So while contemporary accounts of the actual battle vary a little bit, most historians who have looked at these 4 prints believe that they give us a pretty good account of the battle and what happened in the events of Lexington and Concord. So Doolittle at this time is he's not a trained artist, so he's not trying to paint in any sort of style or give us any of the grandeur and heroism that was in some of the more academically trained painters that we're going to talk about. He was really just concerned with getting an accurate representation of what happened and sharing that information with people in New Haven and then obviously in the other colonies as well. So these are a really interesting source to talk about when we talk about contemporary views of the Revolution. But again, these are done a few weeks after the event unfolded. So the term contemporary at this time sort of means just, after it's happened, but within the time frame of the war itself. So then we come back to the sketch of Benjamin Tallmadge that you can see on the left. So this gives you a chance to see it maybe better than on the one that we had in person. And on the right, I found a portrait miniature of another officer who served in the 2nd Continental Regiment of Light Dragoons. And you can see that both of these, the uniform is done in fairly the same manner. The helmet's fairly the same. They almost look like reverse images of one another, obviously just done in color and one as a sketch. The man on the right, you can see it's Thomas Y. Seymour, who was a lieutenant, painted in 1793. And both of these, so I didn't mention who did the sketch, but both of these are attributed to an artist named John Trumbull. So John Trumbull is a pretty well-known artist. You probably have heard of him. You probably, whether you know it or not, have seen paintings that he's done of the Revolution, and he's who we're really going to talk about today moving forward. So John Trumbull is the son of a Connecticut governor. He's perhaps the single most famous history painter in American history, period, for what he did in the years after the Revolution. So history painting is a specific genre that refers to paintings that document an event from the past as opposed to a single person, which is a portrait, or just a scene of general life, which is generally called genre painting. So history painting is trying to capture something from the past in a piece of art. Traditionally, it referred to classical history and biblical history, but in the 19th century, artists really began to use history painting to document recent events, the history that's unfolding around them, and that's what Trumbull does. So John Trumbull is actually a veteran of the Revolutionary War, and he has close connections to Washington. So it's likely that John Trumbull and Benjamin Tallmadge were aware of one another, possibly met, possibly knew each other. I don't want to speculate, but they definitely moved in some of the same circles and had some of the same connections. So Trumbull joins the army in 1776, rose to the rank of colonel, and this includes service as aide-de-camp to Washington himself. He resigns in 1777 over some disagreements about his commission and when it started, and his, feeling that he was sort of, not given what he was deserved in his commission, and he decided to leave the army. His younger brother, who's Jonathan Trumbull Jr., so it sometimes gets confusing with their names, also serves in the military, and he actually serves as secretary to Washington from 1781 till the end of the war. And his younger brother, the artist's younger brother, actually communicates with Tallmadge multiple times while serving as secretary about Tallmadge's information gathering activities. So again, there's another connection between the artist John Trumbull and Benjamin Tallmadge. Possibly, this is what led to him doing the sketch of Benjamin Tallmadge that you see here. So here's a self-portrait of John Trumbull done in 1802. This is at the Yale collection. So I will say, if you want to see John Trumbull's artwork, Yale has a fantastic collection of it. There's also pieces at the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, and then the Worcester Art Museum, I think, has maybe a few as well as going down to Washington, where you'll see some of the paintings we're going to talk about today. So Trumbull leaves the army. He travels to Boston. He wants to study art under a man named John Singleton Copley, who's another very well-known artist. So he goes to Boston. He discovers that Copley has actually left Boston and gone to England. So I find this really interesting that while the war is going on, if not escalating, there are American artists who are still traveling to England freely to study art. So Trumbull decides to follow Copley. He arrives in London in 1780. His ultimate goal was to learn history painting, the art of history painting. So he goes to London to study with a man named Benjamin West, who is an American artist who had gone to England and spent almost his entire working life there in England. He even became the court painter to King George III. So here's an American artist who is very much embedded in English society. But that's who Trumbull wants to learn from, because West is a really popular, really well-respected history painter. So Trumbull at this time begins to conceive of his grand project, what he wants to do with his artistic career, which is paint the history of America's fight for independence, paint the history of the Revolutionary War. So this quote that you see up on here is a letter he writes to his father after the war, but this is just a reiteration of his goals. The great object of my wishes is to take up the history of our country and paint the principal events, particularly of the late war. So this is why John Trumbull becomes known as the painter of the Revolution, and he really is in many ways. There is another interesting Trumbull-Tallmadge connection that I found while thinking about our Trumbull sketch of Benjamin Tallmadge and the events of Benjamin Tallmadge's life. So Trumbull goes to London. He's there for a few months, pretty much without incident. But then, and you can see the quote here, so he indicates in this quote that he remained in London some time and perfectly secure under the name of an artist. So again, it indicates that artists who were, even if they were American, if they were in England to study art, there was some sort of leeway given, and they weren't suspected or prosecuted or anything like that. Until, and you can see this is the second part of the quote, till the news of the death of the unfortunate Andre arrived. So then he continues, and gave a new edge to the vengeful wishes of American refugees. The arts they had for a long time used to no effect now succeeded, and they had interest enough to persuade the ministry that I was a dangerous person. The occasion united with their wishes, and the resentment of government marked me as an expiatory sacrifice. So what's happening is John Trumbull's in London. The people in England hear the news of the death of this Andre, who we're going to get to, and sort of sentiment turns against John Trumbull, and they actually arrest him for treason. They imprison him for 8 months, and then he's eventually deported to America in 1781. So you have to remember that Trumbull served in the Continental Army. He corresponded with individuals in America, and he made it his sort of artistic goal to paint images of the American Revolution. So all these things come together, and he's sort of viewed as being treasonous, and he's actually arrested again, and eventually forced to go back to America. So this incident, the death of the unfortunate Andre, is what you can see, is what this image is of here. So this is a painting by Thomas Soley. Again, another version of history painting. This is done in 1812, and this is at the Worcester Art Museum. But this talks about an event that Tallmadge was very much involved in and really responsible for. So in September of 1780, 3 men, and they're shown in this painting here, 3 militiamen in New York, they apprehend a writer who's calling himself John Anderson. On his person, they discover letters from General Benedict Arnold and plans of West Point, which is where Arnold is given command. So this is on the Hudson. It's really an important strong point for the Continental Army at the time. So they discover these documents. Their suspicions are raised. They bring the man, Anderson, to the regimental headquarters of the 2nd Continental Light Dragoons, Tallmadge's unit. The commanding officer there reads a signed pass from Andre, giving Anderson, safe passage, saying that he's on an errand for the general. And he decides to send Anderson to the general at West Point and forward the documents in his possession to George Washington. This is when Benjamin Tallmadge, the man we're talking about in this special program, comes back, and he convinces the commanding officer to actually have Anderson returned to their custody instead of sending him to Arnold at West Point. So Benjamin Tallmadge is suspicious. He hears about the documents, and he thinks it's worth bringing this prisoner back and keeping him under close surveillance. So the commanding officer agrees to do that, but he still insists that he send a letter to Benedict Arnold telling him of the man's arrest and all the events that occurred, which Tallmadge doesn't agree with. So Anderson is brought back, and while he's in Tallmadge's custody, Tallmadge learns his real identity, and that is John Andre, who is an intelligence officer for the British. And it was Andre who had been corresponding with Arnold, who had become disillusioned with the American cause, to sort of facilitate his move over to the British side. And in particular, Arnold was going to give command of West Point over to the British for a hefty sum, and Andre was the go-between between Arnold and the British forces. So Andre is under Benjamin Tallmadge's custody. He gets brought to Washington. There's a court-martial, and they ultimately decide that he is to be executed as a spy. Arnold, on the other hand, gets away because the commanding officer had sent that letter to him indicating that John Anderson, who he knew was Andre, who Arnold knew was Andre, had been caught. So Arnold was given notice that his plan had been figured out and had time to escape. But the really interesting thing is that Benjamin Tallmadge covers this event pretty well in his memoirs. So the memoirs of Benjamin Tallmadge include a good discussion about the capture of John Andre. And is also really a moving tribute to Andre's character as a man. So Tallmadge writes, "For the few days of intimate intercourse I had with him while he was in Tallmadge's custody, I became so deeply attached to Major Andre that I can remember no instance where my affections were so fully absorbed in any man." So Tallmadge really indicates that even though they were enemies, and even though Andre was, executed for being a British spy, that as a man he really respected him, and they sort of formed a close bond. So that's a really interesting take on John Andre that you can see there. And Benjamin Tallmadge's memoirs, it's good to note, is actually available online. I think that Hattie Trust has it, so you can go on and read the segment about Andre or anything else you might want to know. But that turns us back to Trumbull. So that was a little interesting connection between Tallmadge and Trumbull. Tallmadge having caught John Andre, John Andre's execution being the thing that led to Trumbull being arrested in London and deported back to America. So an interesting connection there. But now we're going to really look at Trumbull's paintings, and I only pulled a few of his more famous ones. We'll go pretty quickly through them. So Trumbull, after the war, he returns to England to continue his studies with Benjamin West, And he really begins his journey on painting the images of the revolution. So he starts his major project. This includes a number of more finished, larger paintings of larger copies of paintings he had done earlier. So he had been painting scenes and thinking about compositions for a while, and he started to now either copy them as finished portraits or do larger images of them. So he travels really extensively to render the likenesses and all the details he needs for these scenes. So he paints new reference portraits. So after the war's over, he goes around and paints the likenesses of people who we need to have in his images. He copies his previous miniatures, so like the one that you saw of Thomas Seymour, the dragoon officer. He looks through his previous miniatures and copies them in full portraits. He studies portraits by fellow artists, and he reaches out to individuals he wants to include in his paintings to see if they have portraits that he can use for his purpose. He also visits a lot of the sites that are depicted. I know it's, again, it's after all these events have taken place, but he's going and sketching what the landscape looks like, what the site looks like, and how we can put the whole composition together. He's experimenting with different arrangements of figures and the overall composition. But what this means, because he's doing these paintings sometimes 20, 30 years after the events, is that the final product, the paintings that you see, are really an amalgamation of old and new, remembered and reimagined, and historical record and his own artistic license. So again, it's really important when you're looking at portraits, or paintings of the American Revolution, to think about context when you're doing so. So this is the first scene of the American Revolution that Trumbull decided to paint. This is the Battle of Bunker Hill. And this is what's called the death of General Warren at the Battle of Bunker Hill. So this is, a key part of the Siege of Boston in 1775. Trumbull paints multiple versions of this painting. The one you're seeing is actually at the MFA, and it's the smaller version. And it's also the only scene that Trumbull paints that he actually witnessed himself. So Trumbull wasn't so much at the Battle of Bunker Hill, but he was close enough to see it unfold. So this is really the only sort of first-hand painting that he actually did about the revolution. Here's maybe the one of the most famous, maybe the most famous painting that he did. This is the Declaration of Independence, done in 1818. So this is him recreating supposedly the signing of the Declaration of Independence. This is the first painting he completes in a commission from Congress that he got in 1817. He was commissioned to do 4 scenes of the American Revolution to install in the Capitol building, the rotunda of the Capitol building. So this is the first in that series. So some of these paintings are, again, enlarged versions of previous ones he did, and they're all installed there at the Capitol where you can see them today. So Trumbull's goal with this painting, and this is a goal he stated himself, was not to create the most accurate representation of this event, but to record the images of the nation's founders to the best of his ability. So his focus here is really getting the faces of all the individuals involved and getting their likenesses as real to life as he can make them. So if he could not find or create a definitive likeness of an individual that was involved, he simply omitted them from the scene. So again, if he couldn't reference something that was done or create himself, he just left the person out of the painting. He also includes delegates who are not actually present at the time of this event. So again, this is some artistic license taken in creating an event, the event as he wanted to imagine it. And you have to think about that when you're looking at the portrait. So all the individuals in here, to Trumbull's credit, every individual that you see is painted from life or from a likeness that was done from life, many of them by Trumbull himself. So the reason that these paintings took so long, and again, he worked on some of these for 20 or 30 years, is because he would be very meticulous with the details and want to make sure that everybody was, appeared exactly as they were. So here's another painting. This is the death of General Mercer at the Battle of Princeton. So the battle occurs in January of 1777. And Trumbull is again taking some artistic license. He's representing different events that happen at the battle as if they happen simultaneously. So this is not a realistic depiction of the Battle of Princeton. It's sort of his version of how it went with all the different things happening on the same canvas. So he works on this painting from around 1789 to 1831. So that gives you a sense of how long it took him to do all the work that would go into these paintings. And if you remember the first one we looked at, the death of General Warren at the Battle of Bunker's Hill, you can see that this is sort of a very particular style of painting these scenes, which is the sort of heroic last stand, or the moment where a hero of the revolution falls, and this one being General Mercer. And Trumbull does maybe 3 or 4 of this style painting, but Benjamin West and Copley had already done examples as well. So this is an established type of scene. It's one that Trumbull turned to a lot, which is presenting, a hero of the revolution in his last moments. And you can see there, so the gentleman on the brown horse, if you can see, that's George Washington, who came to rally the troops of General Mercer after he had fallen. But again, this is painted as if it's all happening at the same time. Here, this is another one of the portraits that was done as a commission for the Capitol. So this is General Gates accepting the surrender of British General John Burgoyne at Saratoga. So Saratoga, regarded as one of the turning points of the revolution. So this both stopped the British from dividing New England from the rest of the colonies, and also was sort of the victory that got the French to come on and really give support to the American cause. But this is another good example of how long Trumbull spends painting these images. So he completes a landscape sketch of Saratoga in 1791. He doesn't finish this painting until 1821, so it takes him a long time. So you can see on the left, and I love this painting, and it sort of worked out in serendipity, that I had shown a portrait miniature of Thomas Y. Seymour early on to show you an example of another miniature of a dragoon member, of a Continental Dragoon. The man's all the way at the left on horseback in dragoon uniform is actually Thomas Seymour. So this is another example of Trumbull taking a portrait that he's done from likeness of someone and then using it in one of his history paintings to really get that accuracy. So you almost can't see Seymour's face, but Trumbull would have had the miniature in his possession while he was painting that figure on a horse, and I just really like that there was sort of that connection there as well. Moving to the next one. So this is another surrender scene. This is the surrender of Lord Cornwallis. This is done 1819 to 1820. So this happens after the British surrender at the Battle of Yorktown, 1781, which ends the last major campaign in the war. Again, this is another one that's installed in the rotunda of the Capitol. So the British troops being led by an unnamed officer. Well, we suspect who he was, but he's not. He's not a named figure in this painting. The British officer is leading his men in a column. On the left are all the French soldiers assembled, and on the right are all the American soldiers assembled. The man accepting the surrender is not Washington. Washington is the figure, if you can see on the brown horse again to the right. The man accepting the surrender is actually Benjamin Lincoln's, Washington's second in command, and that is because Cornwallis himself did not come to surrender. He sent his second in command as well. And there's a couple interesting people that you can see in the crowd. So Benjamin Lincoln's there. Rochambeau is the gentleman on the horse to the left, the French officer. It also includes the Marquis de Lafayette is in the crowd. Jonathan Trumbull, the artist's brother, he decided to depict him in the crowd as well. And then in the front row, fourth from the right, you can probably recognize that gentleman. That is Alexander Hamilton. So he's in this painting as well. And the interesting thing about this one is that for all the likenesses of the French officers, Trumbull traveled to Paris and met as many of them as he could and painted their portraits again to use in his painting. And here is, I think this is the last one we're going to look at, but this is, sort of brings the series full circle. This is George Washington resigning his commission. This was painted between 1822 and 1824, depicting an event from December of 1783. So this is George Washington stepping down as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army before members of the Continental Congress. And this is an event that really solidifies the civilian authority over the military, which is a cornerstone of what would be the American democracy. So this is the last of the 4 paintings that Trumbull did for the rotunda. Some of the figures that are present here, such as Martha Washington and her grandchildren, were not present at the actual event. So again, Trumbull's deciding he wants to change things and sort of make the scene as he wanted to imagine it. He visited and sketched the room, but all the furniture that he saw at the time when he was making the painting was newer than what would be there. And the really interesting thing is that he went back to his painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, copied the chairs and the furniture that was in there and put them into this painting. So again, it's some artistic license taken and sort of him creating an event, almost 40 years after it took place. He's having to make some choices about what it would look like. So like most other artists of the time, Trumbull's creating multiple versions of his painting, which is why you can see some in different museum collections around the country. But more importantly, their art had a broader reach than just the paintings themselves, and that came through the ability to create and distribute fairly inexpensive engravings of their portraits and history paintings. And this is what really affirms the role of these artists in creating a visual legacy for the revolution and an iconography for the new nation. So this is a engraving of the painting of the sign of the Declaration of Independence by Trumbull, done by Asher B. Durand. So he took Trumbull's painting, made a plate, and then produced this engraving for sale. And this is what allowed Trumbull's scenes to really circulate a lot wider than just where they were installed or being displayed at the time. And this, is an example of how much Trumbull's paintings came to signify the new American nation. You can see it was used on some of our currencies. So you might not see $2 bills anymore, or very rarely, but the back of the $2 bill is that painting by John Trumbull. So this is sort of, again, an example of his artwork becoming a symbol of the history of the American Revolution moving forward. But, and I'd be remiss if I didn't end on this note, the art of the American Revolution, if you look at it sort of as a whole, there's two things that I like to point out. One is that it is really a visual record of the elite or the soon-to-be elite. So even portrait miniatures and sketches would have been expensive. So those painted in them, so those people who are represented either had to be able to afford to be painted or had to be important enough for an artist to want to paint them. So this means that they often include politicians, officers, heroes of the war effort, the people who would become sort of the elite of America when the nation started. And also these paintings all really offer an altered history. So few scenes of the war are truly contemporary. Even the ones like Doolittle's paintings are done weeks after the event. And they're instead recreating written accounts, memories, or previous works of art, again, with artistic license in a scene. And you really have to consider the motivation of artists like Trumbull, like the print that Revere did. Think about what the artist or the person producing it would, wanted to gain from doing so. And this is why it's incredibly important when you look at the art of the revolution. It's a great source, but to also utilize the rich body of primary sources that exist. So documents, diaries, written accounts, newspapers, all those other things that can help give you a more informed sense of what was going on, because you can't always rely on what's appearing in the paintings done during the revolution. But with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and end my screen share. If there are any questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll do my best to answer them. I see that Linda added a link to Tallmadge's memoir, which is great. So recommend, especially if you want to continue watching some of the programs we're doing for the Secrets of the Spy Master series, it's a great resource to turn to. So again, this is just the start of that series, and we have lots of talks, activities, and online content to come. So be sure to follow us on our website, on our Facebook and other social media, and you can see what we're doing. Our next program is Friday at 1 o'clock, where our educator is going to do decoding a spy letter program using a real spy letter from the Culper ring, which will be a lot of fun and really great to tune into. And if you can't make it to any of our talks, they are all being recorded. They'll be put on Facebook and YouTube afterwards, so you can always come back and watch them then. So I don't see any questions. Again, if any come up after we end the program, feel free to email or reach out to us or comment on the video when it gets posted, and we can answer those as well. But and they'll also, so I think I forgot to mention, we're going to be doing blog posts every Thursday, again related to Tallmadge and some of the materials in our collection. So please follow those as well. So really, almost every day during the week for the next few weeks, you can learn something new about Benjamin Tallmadge and his activities and his life here in Litchfield. So thank you everyone for joining us. I know I love to talk about portraits and paintings, so I'm sorry if I went on a little long, but thank you for staying with me, and we hope to see you soon, and stay safe, and thank you again.